Um, so thumbs up if you all can see it. And yeah, just so you know, like if you have a Mac and you there's now a new thing that you can do fireworks when you thumbs up, which I think is really fun and helps me be on Zoom longer for and be more entertained. So yeah, first Goose, embodying feminine leadership where there is no roadmap. Um, you know, I was in the kind of startup culture for a while, and folks would always talk about like tip of the spear and tip of the arrow. And I'm not really that much of a person who's like into like war language, like violent language. And and so I was like, like, is there a better word for this? Or a better phrase for this. And bonus question, if anybody can answer in the chat, if anybody else like recognizes what this arrow pointing up can denote in other cultures, in other like references, points of reference, I'll have fun looking at those later and maybe chatting you up. So there is like multiple places where like so many situations in my work with SGC where I like needed a new phrase for this idea of like being at the tippy tip top of like going into a situation, and it's like, and this is like a little bit of a timeline and you can get a little bit of an idea of all the hats that I wear with SGC. And so while I knew some of the founders and was like kind of like on the edge of that community for several years before 2019, it was really in late 2019 that I got involved with SGC as they were writing their bylaws to actually become a church. And it was folks coming out of the Oakland Decrim Nature movement, which was successful in passing a decrim resolution in Oakland. And we're wanting to figure out how to have like an affirmative, sincere religious practice to provide even more safety, especially for the elders in our community, who, if something were to have an adverse health thing would happen during ceremony that maybe wasn't even involved with ceremony, that we would feel really good about being able to call, paramedics and not get anybody in trouble. So there is like, providing safety for the community was part of was at the core. But also that, like for many of us, this was really a sincere religious practice. And we spent so much time working out the language and, getting into the weeds of our bylaws and kind of into that or coming out of that then as 2020 rolled in, and I remember being on so many Zoom meetings on 2020 around like how to form an ethics council, how to create like the burgeoning aspects of community care and repair. That was also when SPA was starting to form, the Sacred Plant Alliance. And really like figuring out what our external accountability, like yay, thankfully there's Sacred Plant Alliance, so somebody actually beyond SGC would have ethical oversight over us and that we would be accountable to for our ethics. And then as we grew and got more folks involved, realized that we actually needed some dedicated work around our health and safety screening process and our member onboarding process. And in the beginning, I did serve as a member onboarding person. I wasn't the first, but I was the second. And really built out a lot of our technological systems in terms of member onboarding and our processes in communicating. So at SGC, we ask people to hang out with us for at least 3 months and attend at least 8 events before we before we invite them to go through a health and safety screening process and potentially become what we call practitioners. We call everybody practitioners. I know in some places practitioners are the person who like do the acupuncture, do the massage, or do the like facilitating. For us, we call everybody practitioners because we really believe that it is a personal practice for each person, and that each person have all the skills that they need, and that there doesn't like there's no intercession, right? There's no priestly class between an individual and their direct experience of the divine through the careful engagements of the sacraments of our church. And that is our core tenet of faith, what we call a statement of least dogma, that we are open to the possibility that through the careful engagement of our church's sacraments, that folks can have a direct experience of the divine in this lifetime. And I like to add in this body, right? Because so many times, like our experiences are from here up. And I love that during MAPS, one of the Christian theologian presenters said, who went through the Hopkins study, said that we need to have a theology of the body. So it's not just from here up, and it's actually like all of us. And I was like, yay. Um, and so I also have been working on the health and safety systems, and really developing our risk matrix, with the help of some other amazing folks. I also am involved in our existential and palliative care ministry, and now also serve as our practicum coordinator and practicum mentor for the folks who are trying to train up to become ordained facilitators, because we need more facilitators. Actually, the ask is beyond our current capacity. We're all super stretched thin. And so each of these points, like multi-sacrament church, like, who's doing that? Like, when we were starting, like some of the lawyers were like, there's no way you can do that. And other lawyers were like, wow, that's really interesting. Like, sure, I'll help you guys because wow, like that's really what? Like on the tip of the spear, I don't want to use that language anymore. And so it was like all these situations where it was like, man, like we are just like heading into new territory where no one's ever been before. And it's a lot of work to be the first like person or organization doing these things. And that's when it was this past winter when I had to spend a lot of time in Pennsylvania, with my aging mama. And if anybody has been to southeastern Pennsylvania, this might look familiar. So Wawa is the Lenape word for goose, and it became Wawa, Pennsylvania, a place, and then a dairy farm, and then a chain of convenience stores that emerged out of dairy milk delivery, actually, and selling milk. And so I was like driving by this sign and driving by this sign. And then I saw this because it's wintertime in Pennsylvania. And I was like, aha, first goose. And, I kind of made it my mission to like bring this into my language, because I agree with these women from the Harvard Business Review who wrote a book and a article called "The Women in the Labyrinth of Leadership" as opposed to the glass ceiling, right? Their thing was like, no, like it's not a glass ceiling actually, because plenty of women do make it to the top. It's that there's this like labyrinth to actually get there. Like it's like twists and turns, and you have to like know, like be persistent and know where you came from, so you don't end up going back to the same place and retracking too many times. And how do you find your way to the center? And so I think that metaphors do matter because they are a part of storytelling that can compel change. And so that's why I love the language of the first goose. In our training, the last training that we had, the last facilitator intensive workshop we had, I made it a point to say like, oh, you're first goose in it. Like, you just volunteered to be the person that we're actually trying out these systems on, right? Like we're making it up as we go along at this point. Like, yes, absolutely, positively, we understand that folks have been doing this kind of work in some form or another for millennia. And I that was one of the things that drove me nuts at the MAPS conference, actually, is that the medical model like has this like interesting view, as if like they're like this like expert view that they bring in from their ontology, without really recognizing that, like, or paying, in my opinion, enough homage to the fact that like all over the world throughout, like, we 15,000 years ago, there's evidence of cacao ceremonies in the Southwest United States. Like, this is like a long history of working with sacraments. Um, you know, alone a youth runs fast, with an elder slow, but together they go far. And so I do want to just presence the fact that not only do we have elders in the psychedelic community, but we have many elders around the world that we are learning from. And so to part of being first goose is that recognizing that you might be first right now in exactly what you're doing, but you're not the first, right? And that there are many that have come before you that have actually broken that headwind and made it easier for us to be where we are right now. As women, that is certainly true. It was just over a decade ago that we like got the right to earn property after a divorce in the United States. Like, there are first geese behind us, generations and generations. And so I just want to speak that part of the quality of, like, in my opinion, like a first goose these days that embodies feminine leadership is really recognizing that, and really recognizing that, bringing in that wisdom of all the first geese that have gone before us is part of, and honoring them as part of being first goose now. Willingness. I love that I found that little picture of that sprout coming out of the crack, because, there's just a level of perseverance, tenacity, and willingness to just show up. I cannot tell you, how many times just showing up has made all of the difference. And as we talk about, the different things that people are doing in their lives, that might be, your version of first goose, that willingness, to just keep on showing up. And I already talked about first, but not the only first, um, and certainly not the first. And then the other is like, if you've read anything about the V of the geese migrating, that they rotate and that then they go to the back. And there, I was reading in preparation for this, I read some, because I'm like, I want to make sure I have my science right. Um, and in fact, scientists, not with geese, but with ibis, actually, they studied them, and each goose ends up spending about the same amount of time up front, all said and done, throughout or each ibis, rather, that they studied in their migration pattern. And we imagine it's the same for geese. Um, so, oftentimes, by personality, by position, certain people end up as first goose more often than others. While in many aspects of our kind of industrial capitalist society, first goose is a position that's really rewarded, often financially. As this idea of like, what does feminine leadership look like? What does it mean to not actually repeat the same mistakes, but actually create a new paradigm? If any of you actually read the description of this talk, I acknowledge that in some ways, sometimes leadership is almost like a dirty word, right? Because it gets associated, like, who wants to be the leader? Oh, the leader is the one in power. And what does power mean in this culture? It can mean domination, and it can mean manipulation and exploitation. So we often shy away, right? So the good, like, people full of integrity that we actually need to be first goosing it, might shy away from that position, because they don't want to be associated with all of those kinds of power, what I call power over models. But we want to be power with each other. And so that's part of like the rotating leadership. In one of the organizations that I was in early on in my kind of like adult career, finding my feet, I was involved with the Association of Women in Psychology. And the way that they model things, I was one of the student liaisons. It was while I was in grad school, getting my clinical counseling degree, and every position had a co. So there was like teamwork was built into it, and it also creates resiliency, right? Because if everybody on your team feels capable and supported to lead, then folks can take a break, right? And as people in female bodies, who oftentimes have the demands of motherhood, caretaking elders, in addition to their career, like we need, self-care has become very popular, but like really we need breaks. Like we need, in another organization that I've worked with, we've called it yin time, right? So time when we have the ability to just be like, um, yeah. And then so the last point is setting the pace and direction. Um, Listening and adapting. So what the scientists think is that the first goose, sets the pace and the direction, they know where they're going, like they always go to the same spots. But there's many things that can be influencing weather patterns and whatnot, the exact route. And so that listening and adapting, because they also need to have a sense that they're not flying too fast for everybody behind them. And one of the interesting things is that the scientists theorize that all the geese honking behind them are letting them are giving them feedback about their pace, and are they going too fast or too slow? And actually maybe even just giving them encouragement. So listening and adapting, listening to the folks who are flapping their wings behind you when you are first goose. And also, if you're behind the first goose, if you're not first goose at that point in time, listening for when like, oh, first goose is slowing down. Maybe first goose needs a break, right? Maybe there's a lot else going on in first goose's life. And we can rotate those leadership positions. And, in my description, I said that one of the other kind of like longer byline for this talk might have been how curiosity, compassion, and not being afraid to make it up as I go along are responsible for most of the things in life I consider to be successes. Um, and, when I was bouncing ideas off of my housemate for this talk, that idea of compassion really came through in our conversation, because we want to be high integrity, but we also want to make sure that there's room to be human, and to acknowledge that foibles happen, and it's a not if, but when, and that when they do happen, how do we recover? How do we repair? How do we stay in relationship? And how can we inbuild those things? So for back to the geese, if something happens to one of the geese while they're flying and they fall out of formation and can't get themselves back in formation, at least two geese stay with them until that the goose that foibled either perishes, either they die, or they get that goose back into formation with the rest of the flock. And so there's this commitment really to staying in relationship that we do see in that goose migration pattern, and that could be really important in our organizations, particularly in this space. And then the last slide, and I am kind of sad that you can't see the slides. And maybe I will just share this last one, and I won't go full screen so you can all see it. Um, if I don't do full screen, is that good? That we need, like, how can you have a successful day job as an entheogenic or psychedelic first goose? Facilitators are only one small piece of the puzzle. They happen to be a very loud piece of the puzzle right now. But we need software developers. We need accountants. like particularly like for those of us who are doing the spiritual care thing in psychedelic churches, we need accountants who like read up on church tax code and all of that. Like we need you. We need cardiologists because from a health and safety point of view, that's like we have a lot of neurologists working on things and that's amazing, but we need cardiologists. And we need designers of all kinds. We need web designers, graphic designers, research study designers. Yes, we need designers of all kind who can really help us um, craft that situation and that scenario so that folks like feel good about fulfilling different roles as first geese. And I'm going to go back to this one because I also want to go back to this quote that may or may not be an African proverb, but it was coined by Bill Hall who's an American author, that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And then the African proverb that it is most likely derived from is again, alone a youth runs fast, with an elder slow, but together they go far. And I think those two premises are super important, especially as we're in a point right now where there could be a like big growth patterns in what we're doing right now. And how do we make sure that we do it, as Leanna brought up, a sustainable way that feeds us, that nurtures us, also a way that provides a new model of being, a model that has these qualities of a power with, not a power over, that has the models of honoring elders, that has the models of really honoring nature and respecting nature. And so with that, I will open the floor to questions. I will also put this slide back up on if you didn't see it. Um, because yeah, just to give, if any of you have any questions about what it's like for me to work, like my day job being in this space, these are the kind of things that I currently do for work every day.
Thank you so much, Libby. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really beautiful, and I definitely resonated with a lot of what you shared, especially towards the end around like working in traditional corporate spaces and being a part of the psychedelic community in different capacities. And so I know for me, like the journey of psychedelics has really guided me into other work and other desires of what my work looks like in the world. And I also still have to show up in corporate spaces. And I noticed that I'm much more aware of some of the different dynamics of just navigating corporate world and politics and different egos and so many different things. And just even in my space in that and like how I show up in that. So I guess I'm wondering, what would you offer for folks who are, on the psychedelic journey, and working with different medicines, but still have to just like live the day-to-day life, which can, in my opinion, feel kind of mundane sometimes compared to the vastness and the expansiveness that psychedelics open you up to. So I guess I'm wondering like how you navigate just your work and just some of the day-to-day things like working a corporate job when you're also working in the psychedelic space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can speak to this. Um, During the pandemic, I worked at one of the hotels that became a homeless shelter. And that was when we were, at that point in time, I'd only been working as an underground facilitator. That was while SGC was just really forming and before we had the resources anybody had the resources to hire me. And it was really difficult to, on one hand, be inhabiting the space of the entheogenic or psychedelic world, and on the other hand, be going into um, like a physical space as well as like an emotional space that was really gray, right? It was very yeah, it was hard. The contrast was gigantic. And the feelings that it certainly brought up were not easy to deal with. And, you know, I would say you can do one of two things. Find your allies within the corporate space. So, my friends and I joke about putting on corporate drag, right? When we had day jobs, like in that space, like, it's like a costume, a mask, that you kind of, that people dress up in a certain way and they really mask in a way to fit in that world. And you have no idea what some of your other folks there might also be experiencing outside of that milieu. And so, throwing out little like, hey, did you see that thing Michael Pollan wrote? Or hey, did you see that article in the Wall Street Journal about the growth of this industry? Um, and just throwing out things like that you might be able to find allies within your current workplace, that you didn't even know were there. So that at least, like you can have a kind of a subculture between or among you, like that helps buffer you from the dominant corporate culture. And the other part is, corporations and corporate culture work because there's a lot of people with a lot of amazing skills who are willing to trade those skills, for their rent money, for the money to live. And but that the things that they're using their skills, they're not actually very passionate about. And so that was also part of that last bit that I said is like, in what ways can folks who, because we really need folks with traditional corporate skills, like in the psychedelic space, to figure out the sustainability issues, to figure out, in some way, like the legal issues, figure out tax issues, like all these different things. And so the other thing is like, is there a way in which you can begin networking to see if whatever you're doing in the corporate world, if there's an analogous position someplace in the psychedelic world where you can actually use your skills over here. And so, yeah, I feel like those are, yeah. But the other thing is like fill your cup, because your job, it sounds like your job really drains it. And fill fill your cup and have good boundaries with your job. Like that's the most basic like practical advice that I could give for like tomorrow. Have good boundaries with your job.
So much gratitude. Thank you, Livy.
Thank you. Eric, did you have a question? Were you the one who popped up before?
First, a comment. I loved your presentation and your use of language. Um, and I want to add a word to your vocabulary because I think it's what you are to SGC. Do you know? Um, let's see. Just dropped the word here. Um, uh, I'll ask my question and come back to that word for you. As a very articulate observer, and as the entheogenic industry emerges, could you share your greatest hopes and greatest fears?
Sure. Well, I am going to actually plagiarize my greatest fear from Dr. Yves Boussaint, who works at Dana-Farber. I got to have conversation with him at MAPS, and I asked him what his greatest fear was because I felt like he had a better view of the landscape. And he said that the drug companies would push forward the rescheduling of synthetic psilocybin without actually rescheduling like grown fruiting bodies or mycelium of psilocybe cubensis and other psilocybin containing mushrooms. And so, I think that's very specific, but that encapsulates my fear that the big moneyed interests on, I think is what is it, K Street, right? All the lobbyists will so narrowly focus on a medicalized model that it will inhibit the decriminalization of indigenous practices and actually keep that firewall. So that's my biggest fear. Yeah. And then my greatest hope is, yeah, my greatest hope is that, okay. So psychedelics in and of themselves are neutral, right? Like that window of metaplasticity, that critical window afterwards, it really depends on what folks are exposed to in terms of, what gets reinforced. And so, we've seen this, that just taking a sacrament is not going to like all of a sudden make a person a better human being. Um, my great hope is that these sacraments will remind us that we actually really do love to be in community. I think that this is a really potent time for humanity, having just like, we're just really coming out of the pandemic, even still, in many ways, and that period of like isolation and people being, like separate and polarized, that the experiences that we have with sacrament can remind us that's actually really not what we want, and that we want to be tolerating, not only tolerating difference, but honoring difference, that we want people to be their full spectrum selves because we want to be our full spectrum selves, and that we want to like lean into the tools that will actually help us figure out like, okay, if your full spectrum self doesn't play nice with this other full spectrum self, it doesn't mean that you need to kill or annihilate that other, like that other that doesn't feel good. It just means reconfiguring humanity, right? Like, okay, we can each have our own ways of being, and in some culture maybe left means one thing and right means another, and in the other cultures the exact opposite. And all those things can exist. All those things can exist. It's just a matter of knowing where you are and being willing to entertain the possibility that other things do, others do exist. And if you're not comfortable with that for whatever reason, you can do what nature does, right? When nature has precious DNA that is threatened in an environment, they put their strongest, like a flower will like surround itself with more resilient forms of itself to protect its less resilient forms of self. And we can do that. Like we can take these cues from nature, in ways that are not predicated on violence and not predicated on genocide, but actually predicated on giving each other space, like taking care of ourselves in community, allowing our communities to be flexible, staying in relationship. Yeah, and that these sacraments will remind us that actually that's a lot more fun. Like that's just a lot more fun and interesting.
Thank you. And while you were talking, I did think of that word that slipped my mind. The word is factotum, and it means somebody who does everything. And I see you in that role in SGC, that you play so many different roles for us in that wonderful church. But I have a question for you there too. Um, what of your many roles do you enjoy the most? Find the most
Hmm.
fulfilling,
So
and why?
yeah, I think the role that I probably enjoy the most is the practicum cohort mentor, which is one of my more recent roles, because it really challenges me to articulate, like, I've been holding space in various ways for 30 years now, and I've learned from so many amazing teachers. And having folks ask me, so why do you do it this way? Like, okay, this is in SGC, we have our liturgy, and then we have what we call the art of facilitation. So the liturgy is like the bare bones, and it's like what you need to do the thing. But then within that, there's like folks have like their art of facilitation. And so people really asking me like, why did you say that thing at that time? Or where did this practice come from? And having me articulate my own kind of metaphysics of ceremony and holding space for people, like interwoven with my own experience, has just like the challenge to articulate that and express to somebody else why I do the things that I do when I hold space for people has just been amazing. And I did put the link to my slideshow in the chat. I'm gonna be human here for a minute and just express like my disappointment and like let my 3-year-old or 5-year-old and be like, but I worked so hard on it last night. I want you all to see it. So yeah.
Livy, we
Yeah.
still have like a good 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this idea of, what you were saying, that it can all coexist. We can coexist. We don't have to go down this path of war and conflict and etc. The paradigm we're inside of the dominator paradigm. And I think it's both. I think it's a disintegration of the old and an integration of the new. And I think what those of us who are like these wild geese, which I think a lot of the women talking here are wild geese, we're leading the way in uncharted territory, because we have to discover what a new way to be is, and then we have to be able to share it and or model it, and it takes so many things, so many things. But I think the biggest challenge we all face is that we're inside of a system that is run on those old paradigms, and it's a very powerful system. So
yeah, let me speak to that because so at one point in time I actually worked in the new economy sphere, right? So I feel like I've been working on this issue of the power over model and how to dismantle it or let it dissolve or disintegrate it for a long time, and coming at it from a variety of ways. Eric mentioned the word factoidum, I think it was, he said. I use the word polymath. I happen to be somebody who loves learning for the sake of learning. I also resonate with what Barbara Scher calls a scanner as opposed to a diver, and so like looking at systems like from like the eagle eye point of view. And one of the things that I came to in my work, like that intersected at one point in time between permaculture and the new economy, when I was working for the Public Banking Institute, was that like the system we have now, all right, and so like there's the interlocking circles that folks talk about in terms of like a balanced view where there's like people, environment, economy, and if like we all had those like balanced, like we'd be in good shape. And what has happened is like our economy and the current model that we can trace back like through Western civilization and historical models, the economy has grown and grown and grown to the deficit of people and environment, right? Like our economy literally takes trees and turns it into a product. It literally takes relationships and turns them into products. And so the people and the environment spheres are shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. And this economy sphere, I mean, back in 2013, the value of just hedge funds alone was 13 times the gross domestic product of the entire planet. Like, that's insane. That's this gigantic economy bubble. And at this point, I believe that it's not just an extractor economy, that's not just extracting, but it's actually siphon. And if anybody's ever created a siphon, you know that once you get it going, it just runs on its own. And so there's like all these places in our life that this like giant juggernaut of the economy is siphoning off of our people and our environment to grow it larger, 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 larger. And if we can just figure out the places to start to unplug those places in our own lives, right, where we're actually reclaiming the sanctity of our relationships, right? And you can talk about transformational relationships versus transactional relationships. You can talk about, like, okay, instead of turning trees into paper, let's actually turn money back into trees, right? Like, can we plant, like, there's simple, simple things. But I feel that that's also a really great metaphor for our social dominant, like what we think of as the way that we are in the world. There's so many ways in which we are just on autopilot, and that if we slow down, we can begin to like figure out the ways of like, oh, that's a way that I'm actually othering people in my life. Like, can I undo that one? Can I bring back more people into like, if we have like a personal economy sphere, like, can I actually then build more robust relationships? And similarly, can I build more connection with nature by unplugging the kind of on autopilot ways of being? And I think that as first geese, as you know, then that's absolutely that most of the people on this call are absolutely positively first geese, that modeling that in community is, you know, like essential. So when I was speaking to Yvonne earlier, Ivana, I mentioned boundaries, and so in all things there's kind of this balance, right? Because like while yes, we want these Venn diagrams and we want connection, we also want a sense of autonomy, and we want a sense of like where our power is coming from within ourselves. And well, it's amazing to have those experiences of disillusion and ego dissolution with our sacraments. The power of coming back to oneself and experiencing like the personal relationship between you and nature, the personal relationship of you as a self, as a unique expression of, if you, the divine is how I talk about it, and wanting that for each other person. And how does that show up in relationship? Oh, okay, like what they're saying right now does not vibe with me at all, but because I want respect for all the ways in which I'm weird and might not vibe with people, I'm just gonna like play this out. And I do really think it starts at the level of our own interactions. I don't know that we're going to solve world peace without concurrently people like understanding these dynamics in their personal relationships. To what you were saying about the dissolving, like, or dismantling, I've kind of come to the Bruce Lipton and Swami Beyondananda had a great audiobook called something transformation, like evolutionary transformation or something like that, or transformational evolution. And they talked about letting the dinosaurs fall by their own weight and just getting out of the way. And in so many ways, like that is my perspective at this point. Like that we build the concurrent imaginal cells, right? The butterfly, the caterpillar, that we're actually building these organelles with our little imaginal cells, like imagining the things that we want the next evolution of humankind to look like. Um, and just like getting out of the way of the dinosaur, like not getting squashed until the dinosaur, because it has a tiny brain and a big body, right? There's only a few people, like there's only 1% of the world actually controlling all the world's money. Until that system falls on its own weight. And then there are a bunch of us butterflies waiting, like already building systems to be like, okay, when the shelves stop being full of products from China, do we know where to source our food? Do we know where to source, what to use instead of toilet paper? Like, yeah, get your kids like diaper wipes and use pee rags. Like there's like really super common things. Grow a garden, learn how to feed yourself. Get with a neighbor if that's not your skill, right? And then that's where like our imaginal cells become organelles, because we might not have the green thumb, but somebody else does, but we have the sewing skills, right? And I know that seems very idealistic, and it feels idealistic. I'm gonna start crying right now because it feels really far away and idealistic right now where we are in the world and everything that's going on. but if I'm not here to help bring forth that vision, I'm not sure why I am here. And you know, it can be easy to lose hope. But it's like when you're first goose, feeling the wings flapping behind you and knowing that somebody else is willing to come and be first goose and reading their stories, that yeah, it makes it seem a little bit more possible. And you know, I have there's a metaphor I got from one of the 13 grandmothers. I'm not going to remember her name in this moment right now. I'm sorry, because I got a little emotional and that hijacked my brain, my frontal cortex. But you know, she really posed this question to me, like, no, really, like if you can be so cynical, why are you here? And the answer ended up being in that ceremony, we're all going to step on each other's toes sometimes through a process of transformation. And if that can be the way that we're just stepping on each other's toes through the transformation of what needs to come, like I'm here for that. But like this like grand demolishment and like collapse of the structures that we know as human civilization, and mass chaos and mass climate change disaster, like how can we avoid that, right? How can it just be like stepping on each other's toes while we're all trying to dance together, instead of the dance floor collapsing under us?
Mhm.
I have a thought about that. I think it's about, turn my video on. Um, I think it's the consumer culture. It's about taking, and so it's taking on all sides, taking on both sides. And I think the shift has to go from taking to giving. You know, these polar opposites are really significant. Taking to giving, like a generosity, and that also brings in receiving, which is a really feminine quality. So rather than competing, it's about giving and receiving. And we can start to do that in our small little psychedelic communities, but it's going to spread. And the reason it's going to spread is because the hunger to grow beyond where we are now is not just in our hearts. We're not the only ones crying about it. There's a lot of people crying.
Yes.
So I think it's going to happen, if we just keep on doing what we're doing right now and supporting each other, maybe helping each other kind of, create a larger net.
Yeah. And don't get me started about competing potentialities. Like, yeah, no, there's the no enemy sticker. Those of you might be familiar with, some folks in Santa Cruz created, and it's these two fists, and it's like, it could be fist fighting or it could be a fist bump. It's like it depends on how you look at it, but it says no enemy. So it's very clear, like, oh, and what if we did really look at the world as if we had no enemies, as if like one person's existence did not predicate another's eradication or annihilation, that it is about competing potentialities. And like, yes, and some, and is annihilation like such a bad thing? Like, death happens. I think that's also a huge, huge component of this, is the way in which our culture is death phobic. And that's why the existential palliative ministry is so dear to my heart. I feel like actually resolving our death phobic culture could go a long way, because in many ways that's the fear that they hold over us, right? Like to get us to comply and participate in a system that we don't fully endorse, is like, oh, is like our capitalizing on our fears. And ultimately, what are we afraid of? Like when you get down to it, when you, okay, well, what if that happened? What if that happened? It's like, oh, I might die. I might cease to exist. And I think that's another potential way that that these sacraments can go a long way in helping us bring a different version of humanity forth, is by addressing, helping us address our death phobia, and practicing dying. Because once we realize that that isn't so bad, we do become a lot more fearless, or at least I've become a lot more fearless in my daily life, after really wrestling with some of those things. Yeah. I like to remind myself that the only enemy is the inner me, as within, so without. yeah, how many times do we get in our own way? Because, and like, that's another part. I mean, parts work. Like, okay, the fact that IFS is like the hottest thing right now, that like that's what made the fire marshal come and clear like people out of a room back in Denver last year at MAPS. Like, and parts work is very, very much so tied to a lot of different indigenous cosmologies and ontologies. The fact that we are able like to actually have conversations around like the fact that we can be our own worst enemy in this like sophisticated psychological way. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of hope. I think that there's a lot of hope. And I don't want to be blind to all the folks that are suffering either right now.
Livy, I wonder, you mentioned something in passing that really resonates with me. I try and work a fair amount with people in the last stages of their life, and part of it is being an activist, trying to get the DEA to loosen up um, access to psilocybin for these folks. But would you address briefly your work with the Seattle group that is working on palliative care and end of life?
Yeah. And so I will say, what we've learned, and this resonates. I saw a panel speak on this last week at Discovery Sessions in San Francisco, and the three folks who all do this work as well said the same thing. And so I feel good about putting this forth. That on the deathbed might not be the best place for a person to have their first experience with the sacraments. Death is already a super psychedelic event in and of itself. And so the closer somebody gets to the actual transition, if they're not like a seasoned psychonaut, the less appropriate it actually might be. That actually making sure that folks have access to the sacraments pretty much as soon as diagnosis happens is really like what we're moving towards. The body load can be the body load of whatever illness that they're wrestling with can be such that it preclude like as it advances, it precludes the opportunity to work with sacraments. And so like just being like getting like the DEA or somebody to say like, I mean, I love the right to try laws and I absolutely 100% agree with them. And like focusing so narrowly on that, I want to make sure that we actually retain a path to folks having access like as soon as they get the diagnosis and as soon as those questions start coming up. And maybe even it doesn't have to do with diagnosis, that and that anybody wrestling with these big existential questions, maybe it's because they just lost a loved one, right? And so the death has come to call on them in that particular way, and ignited these bigger existential questions around mortality. Yeah. And so like totally support the right to try laws. And I feel like that is a super amazing and strategic pathway. And yeah, that because it sucks when a person is going through preparation. And I had this happen to me just a few like earlier this wait, what no, yeah, earlier this year. Um that yeah, the person actually did surrender to death after their second preparation session. We never got to do the journey itself. And so starting sooner. Yeah.
I'm hoping, by the way, that the people who are interested in providing help to the dying can expand their role a little bit, and after the death, provide services to the next of kin, provide services to the people who are then going through the trauma of losing a loved one.
Absolutely.
If if the Seattle project,
Well, and just so you know, Eric, the ministry, the EPM ministry, which has become bigger than working with the Ames Institute in Seattle. Actually, we are developing like as a ministry to be able to minister for folks who death has touched like in whatever way, so that the services are not specific, excuse me, to the liturgy itself. And so we definitely are super mindful of that and cultivating that. We have a lovely person who actually is a hospice chaplain in Arcata, who is willing to volunteer and help train folks up to provide that kind of support to next of kin.
Lovely.
Libby, we have a couple minutes. Can you give us your contact information and how you can be reached?
Yes, absolutely. I will just type it in the chat here.
Can you just say it out loud for the recording? That would be awesome.
Sure. Livi at sacredgarden.life is my email address. I don't do social media. I went on a social media break in the beginning of the pandemic and never went back. But yeah, Livi at sacredgarden.life. My domain name, livijoy.com, is not working, and I wasn't like, this was a good like reminder that I need to get it up and running, but it's, yeah, I don't have a personal website right now. Really, my personal work has fallen away with the work that I've been doing with SGC has been pretty all-consuming.
Thank you again. This
Yeah.
is
That said, if somebody is like really super interested in working with me, like as a facilitator, I do still facilitate one-on-one work and open to that. But yeah.